Hi again, everyone. From Cedar Rapids, I am Bob Ask with my story. My life in historical context. The big world and my little world. Today, it's vignette number 17. I've entitled our thoughts for today, as a coach, some memorable tidbits beyond the games, beyond the crowds. Today, our vignette goes into all the things behind the game itself and is sort of a sequel to vignette number 9 when I talked about my 25 years as a Jayhawk football coach and the glory years and all of that. This is sort of a sequel to that, but I'm going to go beyond those 25 to both sports, 2 of them that I coached, and 3 schools. There were 2 others, you remember, besides Jefferson. So I'm going to go into some experiences that now are memories and now also have become history. Remember, we've pointed out all along in this venture that stories need to be recorded and need to be shared because they're of interest, yours as well as mine. And I call these today my adventures in coaching. Before we point out getting into the adventures, the place to begin would be a little bit more on my job description, because very few people really know how much is involved beyond the usual knowledge. My job description as a varsity football coach for 30 years overall, concerning the staff. At McKinley, I coached football for 5 years. There were 2 of us in the Mississippi Valley Conference, head coach and me. Now they have 8 or 9, huh? And then at Jefferson, my 25 years, we were 3 at the very beginning, varsity head, line, me, back, and then we added 1 more, but never went beyond 4. 4 coaches over all those remaining years, handling 50, 60 guys in all facets of the game. I eventually, toward the last few seasons, we started to specialize, and I became the varsity offensive line coach in charge of all the blocking rules and procedures. Now, behind the scene, what did I do? I put together the annual playbook. This is the 1977 annual playbook. And when was it written? By me, put together by me, with the help of course, and the advice and direction and decision making of Coach Jack Fisk. I did this in the summertime. And here you have offense, defense, kicking rules, all the little things that are going to be the basis of our team going into 1977. How many people know that we had a playbook? You have to be intelligent and very smart to be a football player. There's an awful lot to learn. So I did the annual playbook. I did game plans for each week. After a Sunday meeting, films and all, putting together our game plan. Back home, Sunday night, I put it together, rolled it off the press at Jeff the next day for a 7 o'clock Monday morning squad meeting before I went to my teaching. I made the itineraries with Coach Fisk for the traveling squad and the details of a road trip and for home games. I did, as I noticed earlier, was the one who put together with the vocabulary and the rationale for all of our blocking against the different defenses. I wrote and put together the season summary of each game and the stats. I did player evaluations toward the end of our career. We started to do more and more of that, and graded them even. It was a grade. And then there came the postseason banquet duties, where I was in charge of the invocation. I was in charge of awards, along with the other coaches, and presented the annual Hall of Fame. All of those were a part of that job description. Moving into a different paragraph here. For the public, football is a game. For coaches, it's a job. It's work. And I like to just point out the obvious, but to make an impression. It's a physical job. Let me explain what it was like. I think you kind of know, but let me explain it. Coaching begins after your primary job is over for the day. You're already tired. I've given 5-hour lectures. I'm tired at 3 o'clock. That's when coaching begins. You're always on your feet. Remember Bobby growing up with feet that kind of hurt things along the way? Remember the Navy situation? I was on those same feet for another 2 or 3 hours. And there, for several years, went on to a Kirkwood night college class that I taught at the end of the day. So you're on your feet. You remember those hot 2-a-day practices in August when you're just weary with perspiration after the long summer. You remember the cold, the rain, the heavy gear in November. And then throughout the fall season, by 5 o'clock, the hunger pangs begin. And for me, you start thinking of Maryland's meatloaf. What a physical situation it is. Let's now begin the tidbits, a quick ride through some of my adventures. It was a cold, rainy night down in Clinton in 1969. It had rained all day. The Jeff Band went to the game, never got out of their bus because the rain never ceased. It rained so much before and during the game that the end zones were flooded. Well, we won the game 28-0. But a player came up to me in later years and he said, "You know, Coach, I almost drowned in the Clinton game. I was under a pile in the end zone and I was gurgling. Wouldn't that have been something? Player drowns in a football game." That was at Clinton. Just think. Shelley, something's happened here.
Oh.
Okay. Let me repeat that. We had a little glitch there.
Sorry.
At the Clinton game, one player almost drowned. And then there were two games that I remember because they were never played. In 1959, our last two games were canceled because of blizzards. We played 7 games in 1959, Jeff's third season, and instead of coaching, I was shoveling snow. Another adventure on Labor Day, after those 2 days, and we got a 1 practice in with watermelon and an afternoon rest. Bucky Buchanan and the managers and trainers feasted us with watermelon after the Labor Day. That was a day we looked forward to. I'll never forget in 2014, an overtime game against Kennedy, not too long ago, where I was standing by the fence with good friend Todd Hunt, and we were worried, as was the crowd, going into overtime against the Cougars. It got to the point, I remember, I clutched Todd, hugged him, and said, "Todd, I can't look. Look for me and tell me, did we win the game?" He looked, he watched, he told me we won. Todd and I laughed at what we call the big hug by a coach who couldn't watch, and we won the overtime game. There was a game that I'll never forget on the sidelines when I saw one of our reserves eating a hot dog during the heat of battle. Eating a sandwich? Well, I kind of chewed him out. I remember that. Because you can't eat during the game? No, because he didn't even share. Just kidding. Fun. I remember sitting at a track meet just a few years ago when Bob Brooks came up, the great sports announcer, sat by me. We chatted about our age as we were approaching the age of 90. And he said, "You know, Bob, the Jayhawk football teams of the 1960s were the greatest high school football games I ever covered." Bob Brooks. I'll never forget, on a road trip to Dubuque, we hit a cow on the road and delayed the game a couple of hours. Cow on the road delays game at Dubuque. I remember a game of Jefferson's long after I coached, standing by the railing with one of my favorite Jayhawks, Mark Whitting, a good player, a wonderful young man. And we heard the Jefferson band play the fight song. And I said to Mark, "You know, at my funeral, I wonder if they'll play the fight song." And Mark said, "Well, Coach, if they don't, I'll be humming it." Mark Whitting, a fun adventure. And then I'll never forget, back in 2012, new coach Brian Webb, and we broke a losing record up at Dubuque. And everyone, I can tell you honestly, I loved and appreciated that victory as much as I did the state title games, because we needed it so badly to break a losing string. The next game, assistant coaches Andrews and McShane came with the ball from Brian Webb, and I have the game ball as a prize. We've talked before about the Big 65 Dream game against Davenport Central. Well, 50 years later, there was a 50-year anniversary of the great game on October the 1st, 2015. And in the pre-game write-up in the Gazette, Mark Dukes, Jayhawk, writer, athlete himself, wrote this in his Gazette article, the 50th anniversary of the Dream game. Here is the copy in the Gazette. I have here a picture of Becky with me at that game, and he goes on to point out in his coverage, he sort of centers it around my role that day. Kind of interesting. Mark puts it this way. Bob asked, dusted off his slightly tattered 1965 personal diary this week, and flipped the pages to Friday, November 5. In impeccable penmanship, Ask documented the pep assembly in which he delivered a speech. The handcrafted signs posted up and down the hallways, and a one-word description of the end of what was the great high school football game ever in Iowa. The word Bedlam, Ask wrote in his diary, describing the end of the game. After his game-setting coverage, the article goes on like this. Ask, 89, was the line coach and history government teacher at Jefferson for parts of 5 decades. He has kept a diary for 75 years and wrote the school history high on a hill in 1984. 2 big memories that I cherish. I was fortunate to coach the first night of Kingston Stadium in 1952. First game, first night with McKinley. There were 2 games that night. And then I also was fortunate to coach the first Jefferson game 5 years later, 1957. And George Heidinger and I were the 2 that can claim those 2 adventures. In 1952, we celebrated the first McKinley game, going back to 52, when the stadium was open, and I was a coach at McKinley. And here is the brochure that was written, and it shows me with a Jeff player and Heidinger with a Roosevelt player in that great first night of Kingston Stadium. This is the brochure of when we celebrated, at that time, McKinley and me in 1952. Another great adventure. I'll never forget the Gazette article the morning after the 1964 game against Rock Island, which we won another state championship, 64 that was, when it shows me leading the pregame prayer that we've talked about before. In 2010, Another Gazette adventure. Writer J.R. Ogden wrote an article about me as an 84-year-old who had just lost his colleague Jack Fisk. He entitles it 84-year-old Ask Watches Coach Fraternity Dwindle. A sad occasion when Jack Fisk joined the many others who had deceased. More adventures. I've always loved the Band of Blue. I always remember those practices early in the morning when they practiced across the street from us. Now they've gone to the stadium. And I kiddingly told Marilyn, better stand up again. There's that school song, and I'm positive no one has heard the school song more than I have. And then, of course, stand up again. There's the national anthem. Band of Blue. I can remember Coach Purnell, the great Linmar coach, told me once, he said, you know, Bob, I'd love to coach at Jefferson. For one reason, they've got the best school song. Greg Purnell, great coach and a longtime friend. I can also remember those hot days when Jerry was just a little kid and he'd come over after practice and they were giving out free, well, somebody had to pay for it, but for the players and coaches, orange drinks and chocolate milk. One per coach, one per player. And somehow I was never thirsty. I always gave mine to Jerry, that little kid who walked up the hill with me and my best friend. And then, I'll never forget, a few years ago, Coach Chris Busine, the present coach, called me up and said, Coach, we're going to start giving a winner's trophy to the big Jeff Walsh game. Do you have any ideas? Well, I thought right away, it's got to somehow include the Cedar River, because that was the boundary line between red-blue, east-west, and they adopted my suggestion, and they now present to the winner the East-West Cedar River rivalry game. Two recent big-time adventures. More blessings for the old coach. In 2017, I was inducted into the first class of the prestigious Jefferson Athletic Hall of Fame. John joined me in 2 years, 2019, and I pointed that out in our Brothers Duel vignette a couple times ago. And then for a year and a half, up until just recently, I labored with my good friend, teacher, coach, historian, author John Hegarty in the production of his outstanding book, 64 Years of Jefferson Football, which he's entitled Fight, Team, Fight. You'll see it in a coming vignette. A year and a half working with John, advising, adding, putting in a punctuation mark or two. It takes two, and I was glad to help him, a tremendous writer, along with all of his football and teaching skills. Looking back, some special memories, special people. I acknowledge Coach Fisk Just think, in his coaching career at Jeff, Coach Fisk won 106 games, lost only 32, tied 2. His quiet demeanor, his loyalty in working with him and on the 3D, never raising a pitch about staff situations. Jack Fisk, a great coach, a great friend. I remember Jeff Stegman, of all my trainers, how he was so loyal and so able that even after he graduated, he and his buddies served us as managers. He helped me in my classroom, brought me, we always laugh, Grape Pop. Great young man, Jeff Stegman, who came to room 119 as my helper as well. And then there's the big three, I call them. John Haggerty, Todd Hunt, Jim Cox, who worked with me on writings in the media guide every year. Articles about the Jayhawk history in football, articles about the incumbent Hall of Fame people, working with Haggerty and Hunt and Cox. This was memories, adventures I'll never forget. I'll never forget Dave Long, the great All-American high school college, living in Arizona. How he still today gives me a ring. But I'll especially remember this. Dave, in his junior year at Iowa, was having trouble in a Western Civ class. Just didn't catch what the professor was teaching. He called me up and said, "Coach, can you help me?" That spring semester, he came up to Cedar Rapids a couple times every week. I taught him Western Civ. Marilyn fed him his meatball supper. Dave Long still remembers that. Then there's Bill Lehman, who's kindly taken me under his care. Bill, one of the few but tremendous players who can say he played 3 years of sophomore, 1 year, 2 year varsity, 3 total, and never lost a game. Bill Lehman calls me up and says, "How are things going with the old coach?" Bill Lehman, one of my Hall of Famers in the Hall of Fame. A fun story. Coming home from the Kinnick game against Dowling in 72, Jack Fisk said when we approached the school, "Oh, here's the trophy. What shall we do with it?" He said, "Here, Bob, you take it." That trophy was in our living room the first weekend. And then I took it up to school for the honor assembly on the Monday morning following. Jayhawks will never forget this routine. When they came to practice, what'd they get? 2 items before 1 item. T-shirt, sock, and jock. Well, they got the T-shirt, the sock, the jock, and then afterwards a towel. 2 of those items players don't even use anymore. Do you know what they were? I won't tell you. but we were spoiling the Jayhawks with even laundry services. How many teams, our coaches never overlooked anything. I can't conclude our coverage of adventures without talking about food, because Jayhawks were well fed. The banquets afterwards, some of them down at Dostal's Catering and up at Jeff, and going to Amana on occasion, eating at coaches' homes for the coaches, going to this coach, and the fun after the games and all the coaches. And then on the road, sit-down meals in those days. The 3-course dinner up at Dubuque and at the Cove on the way home from the Quad Cities. Jayhawks were well fed. I want to point out that, remember, I was a coach of other sports and at other schools. So I conclude with this. My first career stop, Marengo, had a good athletic program. I fondly remember the football field in the fairgrounds and the basketball court in the auditorium stage. Jim Jacobs and Bob Gunzenauer were great players. We could have used them as Jayhawks later on. And just think, some of my Marengo students and athletes are now 90 years old. My first sophomore basketball players were champions in the old 4 school days. Beck, Bessica, Gates, Smith, Madlock, Blakey. Champions, great players. 2 later standouts were Jimmy Owens and Butch Turner. Bill Happel, on my first McKinley football team, was the star Hawkeye in the Rose Bowl. His son became another Bill Happel Hawkeye. I'll never forget one other item about McKinley basketball. Marilyn, Mom, loved to take Jan and Becky to Cove, where we played some of our games at McKinley. And they always gave the kids popcorn. Another adventure. My first basketball softball Jeff team, Ellerson, Sly, Mikesell, the Thomas twins, and the 5 of them were very good and won a game where very few ever got to win, at Davenport. We beat Davenport. I had the flu. I didn't get a go. My friend, Coach Bredesen, took the team, and he always said afterwards he finished his career 1-0, and I didn't coach my biggest game ever there. To football coaches along the way, all great in their aid and kindness to me. At Marengo, there was Harold Wilkinson. At McKinley, Earl Klinsman, Clarence Paulson, Emil Klumpar. At Jefferson, George Heidinger, Ted Lawrence, Jack Fisk, Vern Bredesen, Bob Allen, Dutch Sauerbrei, Ron Sherm, Bob Becker, Mark Chop, Gary White, and an unofficial coach and trainer, Fred Buchanan. I want to especially conclude by mentioning some close Jayhawk friends and partners today who give me loyal support. Not that generation, but a younger generation, but they're already up in their 70s. These people keep an eye on the old coach with a phone call or even a visit on a coach. Bill Lehman, John Hegarty, Todd Hunt, Dave Long, Mark Dukes, Tim Kelly, Jim Cox, and from nearby Mount Vernon, not a Jayhawk, but a William Penn statesman who became a Cornell Rams trainer and helper in administration, the great friend that I hear from all the time, Dick Simmons. And I don't want to forget another from Arizona who visits me when he comes to Cedar Rapids, the aforementioned Jimmy Owens. All of them taking good care of an old coach. Finally, a few hand-on artifacts, I call them, just to show you. Here we have my whistle. There it is. Here again is what I had in my hands at Kinnick Stadium, our game plan for Dowling. Here it is. Here are my coaching books. I never wanted to use a clipboard. I had these in my hand. And in one of these, I discovered, can you believe it? The pencil I used years ago when I ended my football at Jefferson. Just for fun. Any bids and all this wonderful paraphernalia. My adventures